Title: The Endless Road. Chapter 1: The Roadblock. Part 1. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, the rubbery texture of the leather sinking into his palms like a vice. The headlights of his car sliced through the pitch-black night, but the road ahead seemed to stretch out forever, swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness surrounding him. He had driven this route hundreds of times before, though each time felt more oppressive than the last. There was something unsettling about the highway, an inexplicable sense of dread that seemed to pulse in the air like a distant thunderstorm, just waiting to break. The forest on either side of the road was dense and suffocating, the trees twisted and gnarled as though they had been shaped by some ancient, malevolent force. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen a car pass by, nor the last time he'd seen a town or a signpost for that matter. The journey had always felt like a descent into isolation, but tonight the silence was different. It was more profound, more suffocating, as if the road itself had turned against him. The monotonous hum of the engine was the only sound that accompanied him in the darkness, a constant reminder that he was alone in the middle of nowhere. The air was still, thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. He pressed down on the gas pedal, the engine growling louder as he accelerated. The sooner he reached the next town, the better. He was beginning to feel like someone, was watching him from the shadows. Ethan's mind wandered back to the conversation he had earlier that day. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. It wasn't that he had anything to hide. It was just a habit, an unconscious need to withdraw, to be left alone. But now, with each passing mile, he wondered whether that was a mistake. The road ahead was still empty, the same stretch of asphalt that he had passed countless times, but tonight it felt different. The world around him felt thinner, as though the line between reality and something else, something darker, was becoming blurred. He wasn't the superstitious type, but something had been gnawing at the edges of his consciousness since he'd turned onto this road. A strange sense of déjà vu, a familiarity he couldn't quite place. The more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. He turned on the radio, hoping for some distraction. But all that filled the static was an eerie silence, a hollow void that seemed to seep into his very bones. He reached to turn it off, but as his fingers grazed the dial, a faint voice crackled through, unintelligible at first. Then it was clear, or as clear as something that could haunt the airwaves. "Turn back." Ethan's fingers froze. His heartbeat quickened, the words reverberating in his chest like a drumbeat. He twisted the dial, trying to tune it out, but the voice remained, low and insistent. "Turn back, before it's too late." His foot pressed harder on the brake, the car skidding slightly on the wet road as he pulled to the side. The voice cut out, leaving only the usual hum of the engine and the sound of rain tapping against the windows. His breath was shallow, panic creeping into his chest. He glanced at the empty highway ahead, the road stretching on endlessly. There was no turning back. In the distance, through the trees, a light flickered. His heart skipped a beat. A car. But there was no car, only the faint glow of what looked like headlights from a faraway distance. He squinted, trying to focus, but the light was dimming as though it was retreating into the darkness. Curiosity won over caution. With a deep breath, Ethan shifted the car back into gear and pressed on. The rain starting to fall heavier now, as if the sky itself was weeping. The light ahead vanished completely, but something else lingered in its place. Something far worse. The road, which had once seemed like an endless stretch of highway, now felt like a trap, the path narrowing and the trees pressing in closer. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened, his hands slick with sweat despite the cold air. And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, a shape emerged ahead, a figure. At first he thought it was a person standing by the side of the road, but it was too still, too unnatural. His headlights illuminated it fully, revealing a figure cloaked in shadow. The figure was tall, its features indistinguishable, but its presence felt like a force, an undeniable weight pressing against him. Ethan's foot slammed on the brake, the car screeching to a halt. The figure didn't move. It stood motionless, as though waiting for him to make the first move. He rolled down his window, trying to see more clearly. His eyes strained against the darkness, but the figure remained indistinct, a silhouette against the heavy downpour. The rain poured harder, the sound deafening as it struck the roof of the car, a constant barrage of noise. Ethan hesitated. Something inside told him not to speak, not to engage with whatever it was. But the fear inside him outweighed that instinct. "Are you all right?" he called out, his voice shaky, his words drowned out by the relentless storm. No response. The figure stood still, its presence growing more oppressive, filling the air with an almost tangible tension. Ethan felt his breath quicken, his mind racing as he struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. It wasn't a person. No, it was something else, something far worse. The figure took a step forward. One slow, deliberate movement. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his instincts screaming for him to drive away, to get as far from this thing as possible. But his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen, his eyes locked on the figure, unable to move or speak. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the night, swallowed up by the rain and darkness. It was as though it had never been there at all. Ethan sat there, staring at the spot where the figure had stood, waiting for it to return, to reveal itself again. But the night remained still, as though mocking him for his fear. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to look away from the empty road. What the hell had just happened? Was it some kind of hallucination, a trick of the mind, or something more, something supernatural? His mind was racing, but the nagging feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. He had to keep moving. He had to get out of here before something worse happened. But just as he reached for the gear shift to drive forward, a chill swept through him. A sudden gust of wind, carrying with it a voice, low and mournful, whispered through the rain. "Turn back, Ethan. Turn back." The voice was clearer this time, the tone unmistakable, and it came from nowhere. His hands trembled on the wheel. The world seemed to hold its breath. Chapter 1. The Roadblock, Part 2. Ethan's heart thudded erratically, its rhythm too loud in his ears as he slowly shifted the car into gear. The whispered voice still hung in the air, its presence like a tangible thing that wrapped around him, suffocating him with its silent pressure. His hands trembled, reluctant to obey his brain's commands, and for a brief moment, he almost considered staying put, to wait, to listen for more. But the voice had left him paralyzed. And now, it was the silence that unnerved him most. The headlights of his car flickered weakly against the heavy downpour, and he couldn't help but feel as though the world around him had grown darker. The roads, which had once seemed so familiar, now felt like a labyrinth, twisting, shifting, hiding things just beyond his reach. He slammed his foot down on the gas pedal, desperate to move forward, desperate to leave the unsettling encounter behind. But the moment he tried to drive, a low hum filled the air, faint at first, like an electric buzz, but it grew louder, vibrating through his chest, making the hairs on his neck stand up. Ethan glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. Nothing. The road behind him was empty, the rain splashing against the window with a monotonous rhythm. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something watching him. He glanced at the side mirror. Again, nothing. The hum intensified, now reverberating through the air, growing louder, as if the very road beneath him was alive, pulsating with an energy that made the air thick with unease. A cold sweat trickled down his spine. The temperature in the car seemed to plummet, the fogging on the windows obscuring his view, making everything seem wrong. "Stop," he whispered to himself. "This is crazy. There's nothing out here." But despite the words, his body refused to relax. The voice, the figure, the unnerving hum, everything had become too much. This wasn't just a strange night. It felt like something was drawing him deeper into the night, like the road itself was alive, like it was calling him to follow it into the dark. As his foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the road seemed to stretch further, the trees growing closer, their twisted branches clawing at the night sky like skeletal fingers, reaching for him. And then, in a moment of blinding clarity, the world shifted. The hum grew deafening, and the entire car shook as if something immense was pressing against it from all sides. His eyes darted around in panic, his pulse racing, as his car veered sharply to the right, almost sending him off the road entirely. Ethan fought to keep control. gripping the wheel with both hands as his knuckles whitened. He managed to regain his composure, steering the car back into the center of the road, but his heartbeat remained erratic, like a constant hammering inside his chest. The headlights flashed over the road in front of him, revealing a shape, a structure, something in the distance. It was too far to make out in detail, but its dark silhouette stood stark against the rain. He could feel his breath catch in his throat. "Not now," he whispered, but the words fell hollow in the stillness of the car. The road ahead, which had once been so endless, now seemed like a trap, an inescapable stretch that held only one inevitable conclusion. The figure ahead grew clearer with every passing second. It wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. It was a roadblock, a crude barrier made of large wooden beams, twisted and gnarled, as if they'd been pulled from the earth itself. But it wasn't the barrier that made his stomach drop. It was the people. They were standing there, not moving, just watching. There was no mistaking it. They weren't normal. Their eyes were wide open, but their faces were blank, drained of all expression. The figures were still, like statues, each one unnaturally positioned along the road, and their clothes were tattered, stained with some dark substance, as if they had been standing there for years. Ethan's breath hitched, a cold sweat coating his brow. He swerved the car to the side, slowing as he neared the obstacle. His mind screamed for him to turn around, to get out of there, but his body remained frozen. As he slowed to a near crawl, his headlights illuminated one of the figures, and Ethan's heart dropped to his stomach. It was a woman, or at least she had once been. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those eyes, were the color of ash, hollow and empty, staring right at him. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a faint, low breath, like the wind. For a moment, the world stood still. Ethan could hear the soft, pitiful drizzle of the rain against his car, but nothing else. The hum had ceased, the air stagnant, and the figures, they still did not move. And then, from the shadows of the trees, another shape emerged, moving slowly but deliberately toward the roadblock. The figure was hunched over, cloaked in a dark, tattered robe, its head lowered, so that only the shadowed face of the figure could be seen. The figure did not walk like a human. It dragged itself forward, its limbs jerking unnaturally, scraping along the ground like an animal's. Its face was hidden under the dark cowl, but Ethan could sense something watching him from behind that shadow. A presence that wasn't human. The car seemed to tremble as the figure inched closer, its movement slow but purposeful. It reached the group of stationary people at the roadblock, stopping before them, its head lifting just enough for Ethan to see the pale skin of its hands as they clasped together in front of it. Ethan felt something crawl along his skin, something cold and ancient. His mind screamed for him to drive, to run, to escape. But his body betrayed him, his muscles locking in place as his eyes locked onto the figure. Then, without warning, the figure's hand shot out, pointing directly at him. His breath caught in his throat. The eyes of the others snapped to him in unison, their heads turning mechanically, too perfectly synchronized, as if they had been waiting for him all along. And in that instant, Ethan understood. He was not alone on this road. He had never been alone. Something had been following him. Something had been waiting for him. And now the roadblock wasn't just an obstacle. It was a warning. Turn back. The voice was low and rasping, distant but unmistakable, and it came from all around him, echoing through the night like a death knell. The figure, its face still hidden in the shadows, took a single step forward. Ethan could feel the weight of its gaze upon him, the oppressive pull of something older, darker, and more malevolent than anything he had ever known. It was as if the very ground beneath him was shifting, the earth groaning with the weight of an ancient power. His hand went to the gear shift instinctively, but before he could move, the woman in front of him, her pale face twisted in a silent scream, reached out toward the car. The fingers touched the glass. The moment the skin made contact, a jolt of icy cold shot through Ethan's chest, a sharp pain that spread through his entire body. He gasped, but the breath was frozen in his lungs. The world around him spun. His vision blurred, his hands no longer felt the wheel, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if he was still alive. The roadblock had stopped him, but had it also claimed him? Chapter 3. The Hollow Road. The night had fallen deeper into a realm of thick silence as Ethan continued down the road, though road was a loose term for what lay before him now. The pavement was cracked, uneven, as if it had given up the fight against the ever-encroaching wilderness. The trees on either side of him seemed to lean in closer, their skeletal branches forming twisted, gnarled arches, creating a tunnel that closed off the moonlight. Ethan pressed on the gas pedal with trembling hands, trying to break free from the feeling of suffocation, the crushing pressure in his chest. But the air was thick, weighted with something old, something ancient and lurking. There was no sound beyond the steady hum of the engine and the occasional drip of rain against his windshield. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air was still damp, heavy with mist, and the darkness held a chilling presence. The car's headlights cast weak beams across the road ahead, barely cutting through the thick shadows. He felt like he was driving through a dream. No, a nightmare, one that he could not wake up from. He had tried to call for help, tried to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal, nothing but the haunting silence. It had started when he first passed that strange intersection. He had seen the sign, a rusted metal placard with words that had been worn away by time, barely legible, almost mocking. No, turn back. The words were enough to make him second-guess his choice to continue, but in the back of his mind, he had brushed it off. After all, it was just a forgotten road, just a side street. But now, in the solitude of the night, he was questioning every choice he had ever made. The road stretched on and on, twisting and turning with no rhyme or reason, as if it were pulling him deeper into some forgotten part of the world. Each bend in the road revealed something darker, more unsettling than the last. The woods seemed to grow closer with every passing moment, encroaching further into the light from the headlights. And then, without warning, the trees began to thin out. Ethan's pulse quickened. Ahead, in the distance, he could make out a figure, a shadow standing still in the center of the road. His breath caught in his throat. Was it another roadblock? Another strange person like those he had seen earlier? He had thought he was done with the bizarre figures. He had hoped he was done with them. But here it was again, standing just at the edge of his vision. The silhouette of a person, a man, perhaps, standing perfectly still, unmoving. Ethan slowed the car, his heart hammering in his chest. He strained his eyes, trying to make sense of the figure. But the moment his headlights illuminated it fully, the figure stepped forward. Ethan slammed his foot onto the brake. The car screeched to a halt, the wheels protesting against the gravel road beneath them. The man was standing right in front of him, his face shrouded in darkness, but Ethan could feel his eyes on him, could feel them boring into him. The man's clothes were tattered, his figure hunched slightly. But there was something about his stance that was unnervingly still, unnatural even. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Ethan's breath was shallow, his hands clenched on the steering wheel. He wanted to turn around, to drive away from whatever this was, but his body refused to obey. He couldn't look away from the man in front of him. His instincts screamed at him to flee, but he couldn't. He felt as though he had been pulled into something he had no control over. The figure didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. The air felt thicker now, more oppressive. The darkness seemed to swell around them, as if it were alive, breathing, pulsing. Suddenly, the man raised his hand. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat. The movement was slow, deliberate. And then, as if it had been waiting for the right moment, the man pointed directly at him. "Leave." The word was faint, like a breeze whispering through the trees, but it carried with it a weight, a chilling force that settled deep into Ethan's bones. The voice was distorted, unnatural. It wasn't a man's voice. It wasn't human. The car's engine sputtered in response, as if acknowledging the command, and for the briefest second, the headlights flickered, then died completely. The world around Ethan fell into complete darkness. He froze, heart racing. His hands were sweating, his fingers slipping off the wheel as the silence overwhelmed him. The air grew colder, and for a moment, he swore he could hear a distant murmur. Voices, whispers, all at once, overlapping, blending together into an unintelligible hum. Leave. The words came again, this time louder, more insistent, as though they were echoing not from the man in front of him, but from all around him, filling his mind. The whisper seemed to crawl into his ears, into his brain, and the temperature in the car plummeted even further. His breath came out in sharp, visible clouds, despite the warmth of the night. Ethan's heart was pounding, but it wasn't just fear. There was something else, a sensation gnawing at him from the inside. His pulse quickened, his skin prickling with the sharp sensation of something unnatural. He knew, without a doubt, that he was in danger, that he had been brought here for a reason. Leave now, or stay forever. The voice was no longer a whisper, it was a command. Ethan didn't have time to think. He gripped the steering wheel again, his knuckles turning white, and with a single panicked motion, he threw the car into reverse. The tires screeched against the gravel as he slammed his foot onto the accelerator. But as he backed away, the world around him shifted again. The man hadn't moved, but his presence had. Ethan spun the wheel wildly, his car skidding off the gravel road, but the moment he looked up, he saw that the road had changed. The trees were gone, and instead, there was a vast open field stretching out before him. The sky was a deep shade of indigo, an unnatural shade. The stars too bright, too sharp, as if they were watching him, judging him. He slammed on the brakes again, his car screeching to a halt as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The road had disappeared completely. He was no longer on any road he recognized. This place, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. And then, before his eyes, the ground began to move. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the earth trembled beneath him. The field, the sky, everything began to shift and ripple, as if the very fabric of reality was being twisted, stretched, pulled apart. The trees, the roadblock, the figures, all of it. It was like watching a scene unravel, the image blurring into something impossible to understand. The figure was still there, standing in front of him, now surrounded by a swirling mass of shadows that seemed to come alive, swirling in the air around him. But there was no sound, just the heavy weight of the silence pressing down. "Leave," the voice commanded again, more forceful now, deeper, as if it were coming from the very earth beneath him. Ethan didn't know what to do. He wanted to scream, but his voice was lost in the chaos. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his fingers were numb, but he couldn't stop himself from looking up, from staring at the figure that still stood there, waiting. Leave, before it's too late. The figure stepped forward. The ground beneath him trembled again. The world around him seemed to split open, and before Ethan could react, the shadows descended, and then everything went black. Chapter 3. The Hollow Road, Part 3. The darkness pressed in, suffocating and absolute. Ethan felt as though he were drowning in it, his thoughts tangled and frozen in place. He couldn't remember when his hands had left the steering wheel, or when his eyes had closed. The suffocating grip of fear had stolen all sense of time. It was as if the very fabric of reality had snapped, leaving him adrift in a world that was both familiar and impossibly foreign. When his eyes finally opened, he was no longer inside the car. The first thing Ethan felt was cold, the kind of cold that pierced through flesh and bone, a deep, gnawing chill that seemed to spread outward from the very core of his being. His breath came out in uneven gasps, visible in the frigid air, but he could no longer hear it. No sound at all. It was as if the world had become mute, swallowing every noise, every whisper, every breath. He was standing, though he hadn't moved. There was no car around him, no sign of the twisted road, no figure in front of him. There was only the empty, desolate expanse that stretched endlessly in all directions. The land was barren. Nothing but blackened earth, jagged rocks, and twisted remnants of long-dead trees that clawed at the sky with skeletal fingers. The horizon was a sickly shade of purple, the clouds rolling with strange, unnatural speed, swirling as if caught in an unseen storm. No moon, no stars, just an oppressive sky that seemed to press down on him. And then, a sound. A faint whisper, so faint that it was almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Ethan's heart froze in his chest. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a chorus of whispers, hundreds, thousands, overlapping and indistinguishable. A low hum, a collective murmur that crawled into his ears like a swarm of insects. Leave. 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 The word repeated itself over and over, echoing in the distance. Yet it felt as if it were coming from the very ground beneath him. The wind, the air. It was like the world itself was speaking to him, urging him to run, to escape, to do anything. But there was nowhere to go. Ethan spun around, but there was nothing behind him, just the same barren landscape, stretching endlessly, a dark horizon with no end. The whispers grew louder. He tried to shout, to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was tight, his voice stifled, as if the very act of calling out had been swallowed by the air itself. A sudden panic gripped him, and for the first time, he realized he was not alone. The ground beneath him began to shift. At first, it was subtle, small tremors that rumbled through the earth, as if the land itself was waking from a long, forgotten slumber. But then, the trembling grew stronger, more violent, shaking the ground with each passing second. Ethan staggered back, his legs unsteady. He tried to keep his balance, but it felt as if the very earth was warping beneath his feet. The cracks in the ground widened, jagged and deep, as though something enormous was stirring beneath. He could feel it now, a heavy presence, something ancient, something that had been buried for far too long, now clawing its way back to the surface. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. Suddenly the earth split open with a terrible, grinding sound. From the gaping chasm in the ground, something began to rise. A figure, tall and hunched, its form wreathed in shadow, obscured by the swirling dark mist. It emerged slowly, as if reluctant, as though it had been trapped in the depths of the earth for centuries. Ethan's pulse hammered in his chest. His body screamed at him to move, but he couldn't. His feet were rooted to the spot, as if the ground itself was holding him in place. The figure emerged further, its shape becoming more defined as it rose into the air. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the air around him. The thing before him was not human. It was a twisted, grotesque mockery of a man. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, pale and sickly, its eyes hollow black pits, empty of light. Its mouth was a jagged, gaping wound, filled with rows of sharp teeth that clicked together like knives. Its arms were long and bent at unnatural angles, fingers curling like claws, and its body seemed to writhe and undulate as if it were made of shadows, constantly shifting, never still. And then it spoke. "Why do you persist?" The voice was like nails on glass, scraping and grinding against Ethan's eardrums. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. A force that pressed against his mind, suffocating him, bending his thoughts to its will. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. He was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare. The creature took another step forward, its long limbs dragging across the broken earth. With each step, the ground trembled. It was closer now, so close that Ethan could feel the cold emanating from its twisted form. The air grew heavier, denser, as if the world itself was compressing, folding in on itself. "Why?" the creature repeated, its voice growing more insistent, more furious. "Why did you come here?" Ethan felt his heart racing, his breath shallow and desperate. He tried to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey. The thing was right in front of him now, its clawed hand reaching out, its fingers brushing the air near his face. There was no escape, no place to hide. "You should have listened," the thing whispered, its breath icy against his skin. "You should have turned back." The ground beneath him cracked wide open. Before Ethan could react, the earth swallowed him whole. The descent was instantaneous, a rush of vertigo that sent Ethan tumbling through the darkness, faster and faster, deeper and deeper. He tried to scream, but there was nothing, only the soundless void surrounding him, the weight of the world crashing down on him from every side. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. He landed with a sickening thud, his body slamming against a cold, hard surface. The impact took the wind from his lungs, and for a long moment, all he could do was gasp, his chest aching with the effort to breathe. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the barren landscape. Instead, he found himself in a vast empty cavern, its ceiling high above, disappearing into darkness. The walls were covered in strange, intricate symbols, carvings that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, the kind of stench that filled the back of his throat and made him gag. He pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, but as he stood he felt the weight of something watching him, something in the shadows, just beyond his sight. He turned, but there was nothing, only the silence. The whispers returned, faint at first, like a murmur in the distance. But they were getting louder, growing closer. He had no choice but to move forward. With every step he took, the whispers grew more distinct, more urgent. The words were no longer a chant. They were commands, desperate and pleading. Ethan felt as though he were walking toward his doom, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not when he was this far. The whispers intensified, pressing against his mind, filling it with visions, flashes of faces, of eyes, staring from the darkness. The cavern began to shift around him, warping and bending in unnatural ways. The air grew colder still, the walls closing in as though the very world was conspiring to trap him. Suddenly the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and then, from the deepest corner of the cavern, a figure emerged. Chapter 4. The Descent into the Abyss. 1. The Shattered Silence. Ethan's body throbbed with the lingering effects of the fall. His mind spun, disoriented by the disjointed images that danced behind his eyelids. He gasped, struggling to fill his lungs, but the air seemed thick, heavy, as though it was trying to push him back into the void. His fingers grazed the cold, slick stone beneath him, and for a moment, he thought he might drown in the sensation of it, smooth, yet oppressive, like the skin of something much older than anything he had ever known. The ground seemed to hum, vibrating with an unseen pulse. His eyes fluttered open. The cavern was vast, its walls bending in ways that defied logic. The space stretched far beyond what his mind could comprehend. Shadows clung to the corners, swelling and contracting like they had a life of their own. The air was thick with a pungent metallic scent, like blood or decay, but it was older, more ancient, like the smell of something that had long since stopped decaying. Ethan pushed himself to his knees. His head spun as he attempted to focus. The dim light that seemed to come from nowhere revealed the cavern's grotesque nature. Jagged stalactites hung from the ceiling, dripping a viscous black substance. The walls were lined with strange symbols, runes he didn't recognize, glowing faintly, as if they were alive. Every step he took seemed to echo endlessly in the cavern, as though the place was swallowing each sound and then releasing it back to him, warped and twisted. He swallowed hard, forcing his body to move despite the overwhelming sense of dread that paralyzed him. Something was wrong. The whispers, once distant, now clawed at the edges of his mind. They weren't just words. They were intentions, invasive thoughts, so strong that Ethan had to clutch his head to keep from collapsing under their weight. Leave, leave, leave. The voices, soft at first, were now joined by a heavy breathing, a rasping sound that seemed to emanate from the very air around him. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced his legs to move, pressing onward through the endless labyrinth of shadows. He came upon a large stone arch, its surface carved with the same unrecognizable symbols. It stood like a gateway, as if it were waiting for him, its edges cracked and crumbling, but there was no turning back now. Whatever force had brought him here seemed to guide his every step. Part 2. The Threshold. Ethan took a deep breath and passed beneath the archway. As he did, the temperature seemed to drop, the air turning bitterly cold. His breath came out in jagged puffs, each one growing more pronounced. The world around him shifted. It wasn't just the air that was different. It was the very fabric of reality itself. Time no longer seemed to pass in any recognizable way. The further he walked, the more the surroundings seemed to warp, as though the rules of nature were suspended in this place. Before him, an enormous stone door loomed. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its surface was covered in more of the strange shifting symbols, pulsating with a faint, sickly light. It was as if the door itself was breathing, the runes changing and reshaping with each inhale and exhale. There was no handle, no visible way to open it. It was simply a massive, monolithic presence that seemed to dare him to approach. The whispers were louder now, echoing in his mind. The voices were desperate, pleading. Ethan felt his heart race. His feet were moving before he could stop them. A compulsion, a deep, gnawing urge pushed him forward. He reached out to touch the surface of the door, his fingers trembling. As soon as his skin made contact, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the floor, rattling his bones. The door creaked, its massive frame groaning as if waking from a centuries-long slumber. Slowly, it began to open, inch by agonizing inch. Ethan stepped back, instinctively raising his hands as though to protect himself from whatever lay beyond. The space beyond the door was vast, impossibly so. It stretched out into a dark abyss, but the sense of depth was wrong. It felt like a place that had no beginning and no end. The air here was heavy, thick with an unnatural presence. It pressed down on Ethan, filling his lungs with the weight of the unseen. He could hear the distant sound of something massive, moving in the distance. "Do you hear it?" The voice was sudden, breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. It came from everywhere, echoing in his mind. "It's too late now." Ethan's heart lurched. He tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but the words caught in his throat. His mind was screaming, but his body refused to obey. The voice, dark and menacing, wrapped around him, suffocating him. Part 3. The Unseen Stalker. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled once more. He staggered, clutching at the walls for support, as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They were no longer just whispers. They were voices, overlapping, twisting, converging into a cacophony of desperation. "Why did you come? Why did you come here?" Ethan's mind was unraveling. He could feel the pressure closing in, suffocating him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw something. No, someone, standing just beyond the threshold. A figure that seemed to melt in and out of existence, moving in unnatural, jerky motions. It was humanoid, but distorted, its limbs far too long, its face hidden in shadows. He took a step back, but the figure remained, its presence more suffocating than the darkness around him. "Leave! Leave!" The voice that came from the figure was not just a whisper. It was a command, an order that rang through the very marrow of Ethan's bones. Before he could react, the figure lunged forward, its arms stretching unnaturally long. Ethan tried to move, but his legs betrayed him. He couldn't run, couldn't escape. The figure's hand shot out, fingers like claws that scraped across his skin, cold and unyielding. His vision went black as he felt himself being dragged into the dark void behind the door. Tai. Part 4. The Depths. When Ethan regained consciousness, he was no longer standing in the cavern. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, or if time had even passed at all. The world around him was distorted, twisted in ways that defied logic. The air was thick with the scent of decay, like the remnants of something long forgotten. He was lying on the ground, unable to move, unable to comprehend the space around him. It felt as though the walls themselves were breathing, pulsing with a terrible, ancient power. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a single voice, a low, malevolent growl that resonated deep in his chest. It was the figure, the thing that had dragged him here. He couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but he could feel it, watching him. His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes flicked around, searching for anything that might give him an answer. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive darkness that swallowed every trace of light. Then, a voice, this time close, so close he could feel the cold breath against his ear. "You shouldn't have come. the voice hissed. Now, you will join us. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Forgotten. Part 1. The Unravelling. The cold was unbearable. Ethan had no recollection of how long he had been here. The passing of time felt irrelevant, as though the very nature of time had been corrupted by the oppressive, living darkness that surrounded him. Every moment felt like an eternity, a slow crawl through a nightmare that had no beginning or end. The only thing that was certain was the heaviness in his chest, a weight he could not shed, no matter how hard he tried. His body ached, as if every muscle was being slowly torn from the inside out. He had tried to move, to escape, but his limbs betrayed him at every turn. It was as though the very air itself held him in place, suffocating him with a force that was both external and internal. He could feel his mind begin to crack under the pressure. In the midst of this agony, there was a faint light. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a pale, sickly glow that emanated from the farthest corner of the cavernous space. It seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, like the beating of a heart, or something far more ancient, far more sinister. Ethan tried to lift his head, to see if it was real, but his vision swam, the edges of his perception blurring with each passing second. He could hear a low hum in the air, vibrating through his skull. The sound was familiar, but he couldn't place it. It gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, a reminder of something he had forgotten, something he wasn't meant to remember. The whispers returned. Not the distant murmurs that had tormented him before, but full sentences. Low, guttural voices that scraped at his mind like nails on a chalkboard. They spoke in unison, though their tones were not identical. Some were harsh, filled with venom. Others were mournful, broken by despair, but all of them were unmistakable, and each word felt like a dagger piercing his thoughts. Come closer, come closer. Ethan's breath hitched. He didn't want to obey, didn't want to give in to the temptation to follow the voice, but his body moved of its own accord. The pull was irresistible, a magnetic force that tugged at the very fibers of his being. He forced his eyes open, willing himself to move despite the paralysis that gripped him. With every step he took toward the light, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. He could hear his name being spoken, slow, deliberate, as though it was a chant. His name, like a prayer, an invocation, a curse. Ethan. He stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him, but still, he moved forward. The light was within reach now, but it didn't feel like salvation. No, this light was not warm. It was cold, unnatural, like the light of a distant star that had long since died. It didn't illuminate the world. It exposed it, revealed the horrors hidden just beneath the surface. And then, he saw it. A figure. No, figures. They were standing in the center of the light, waiting. The shapes were human, but not entirely. Their forms were distorted, as though they were caught between dimensions, stretched and twisted in ways that defied logic. Their faces were hidden, their features obscured by the shadows that clung to them like a second skin. But their presence was unmistakable. They were waiting for him. Ethan froze, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin as the weight of their gaze pressed down on him. He could feel them watching him, their eyes burning into his very soul, though he could not see their faces. "You shouldn't have come here," one of them spoke, the voice soft, almost affectionate. It was a voice that should have belonged to someone who cared for him, someone who wanted to protect him. But there was no kindness in it, no warmth. There was only the chilling knowledge that whatever stood before him was not human. "Why?" Ethan managed to choke out, his throat dry, his voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, a grotesque, inhuman movement that made Ethan's skin crawl. It stepped forward, the air around it warping, distorting with each movement. Its form shimmered, as though it were made of smoke and shadows. "Because you are ours now," the figure said, its voice now joined by the others, a chorus of haunting, mournful sounds. "You cannot escape." The light flickered, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw something behind the figures, a glimpse of something larger, more monstrous, looming in the distance. But it was gone before he could fully register what it was. Part 2. The Descent Deeper. The floor beneath Ethan's feet began to tremble, and the whispers grew louder. They were no longer just words. They were sensations, emotions, flooding his mind in an overwhelming torrent. Fear, despair, longing. Each whisper contained an essence, an imprint of something that had been lost to time. His vision swirled as the shadows began to writhe, coiling around him like serpents, tightening their grip. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. All he could do was listen to the incessant murmuring, the scratching, the clawing at his sanity. The figure in front of him, if it could be called that, stepped closer. Its presence was suffocating, each step causing the ground to quake beneath Ethan's feet. "You are not the first," it spoke, its voice now more distinct, more clear. "Many have come before you. They too thought they could escape. But you are ours now, as they were." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced, trying to understand, trying to find an explanation for the madness that surrounded him. "You will never leave," the figure continued. "You cannot." Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He was trapped in a nightmare that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, the figures surrounding him stepped back, their movements slow, deliberate. The light flickered once more, casting deep, unnatural shadows across the cavern. A door appeared before him. It was made of the same black stone as everything else here, but this door was different. It pulsed with a strange energy, a rhythmic thrum that resonated deep within his chest. It beckoned him, drawing him forward like a moth to the flame. "You must go through it," one of the figures whispered. The door opened, slowly, reluctantly, as if it too understood the horror it was about to unleash. Ethan took a step toward it. And then, the ground shifted beneath him. Chapter 6. The Door to Nowhere. Part 1. The Silent Echo. Ethan's heart was hammering in his chest, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The door loomed before him, its presence heavy, almost suffocating. There was something profoundly unnatural about it, like a wound in the very fabric of reality itself. It was not the door itself that terrified him. It was what it represented. Beyond the door was the unknown. And yet, it felt like something Ethan had known all his life. A forgotten memory tugged at him from the edges of his consciousness, as if this moment had been preordained. The figures, their unsettling presence, hovered just outside the threshold, silent but watching. They did not speak anymore. Their cold, motionless forms were like statues carved from the same dark material as the walls around them. Their eyes, if they had any, were hidden in the shadows. Ethan could feel them, though, watching, waiting. He reached out with trembling hands, unsure of why he was compelled to touch the door. It felt like it was calling to him, the strange, rhythmic pulse drawing him in like a moth to a flame. The air around the door was colder, the very temperature of it unnatural, like the deathly chill that settled over a corpse long after life had fled. His fingertips brushed the surface, and a sudden jolt of ice shot through his body. It wasn't just cold. It was a deep, consuming cold, as though it had been frozen in time itself. He pulled his hand back, but the sensation lingered, as if the door had left an imprint on his skin. The whispers began again, more insistent this time. Low, guttural voices filled the air, words lost in the oppressive hum of the atmosphere. But there was one word that rose above the rest, repeating itself like an incantation. "Enter." Ethan recoiled. He didn't want to, couldn't, but his body felt like it was no longer his own. The pull of the door was too strong. It was as though the space around him had shrunk, the walls pushing inward, suffocating him, and the only escape lay beyond that cursed threshold. "Enter." The voices beckoned again, louder this time, vibrating through his bones. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind a chaos of conflicting thoughts. His instincts screamed for him to run, to flee from the horrors that awaited beyond that door. But something deeper, something far more primal, kept him rooted to the spot. This was inevitable. The door had been waiting for him, just as he had been waiting for it. His hand reached out again, but this time, the door responded. It moved, not physically, but in some metaphysical way. A low groan reverberated through the air, a sound like ancient wood creaking under the strain of centuries. The door opened, but it did not reveal a room, a hallway, or anything recognizable. It revealed nothing. There was a void beyond the door, a vast, infinite nothingness that seemed to stretch forever. Ethan felt his mind begin to unravel at the sight of it. The darkness beyond was not empty. It was alive, pulsating with an energy he could not comprehend. It felt like it was watching him too, alive in a way that made his blood run cold. And then he heard it, a scream. It echoed from the darkness, sharp and broken, full of agony and despair. It was a scream he knew too well. It was his own. The door was calling him, pulling him into the abyss. Without thinking, Ethan stepped forward. Part 2. Into the abyss. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the world seemed to collapse in on itself. The darkness swallowed him whole, consuming him with an intensity that took his breath away. The air was thick, suffocating, and he felt as if he were drowning in it, unable to move or scream. It pressed down on him, heavy and relentless. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure lifted. Ethan stumbled, his legs buckling beneath him, as he was thrust into a space that was both familiar and alien. The air was no longer oppressive but cold, frigid, like the wind of a frozen wasteland. His eyes struggled to adjust, but the dim, flickering light that filled the space only seemed to deepen the shadows, casting grotesque shapes against the walls. The space around him was empty. He was standing on what appeared to be solid ground, but it felt wrong somehow. The floor beneath his feet was covered in a fine dust, almost like ash, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if they were breathing. Ethan felt the presence of something, or rather someone, nearby. The whispers returned, louder now, but they were different. They were no longer disembodied voices. They were shapes, living things, circling him like vultures. Each whisper carried with it a sharp, biting cold, and Ethan could feel their icy fingers grazing his skin, sending shivers down his spine. The figures from before, those twisted, faceless beings, were here, standing in the shadows, watching him. They were closer now, their forms more distinct, but still shrouded in an aura of darkness. Their eyes, if they even had eyes, pierced through him like needles, drilling into the core of his soul. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat as the figure came closer, its presence suffocating. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice hollow, a sound that seemed to reverberate in the very air around him. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but no words came. He couldn't find his voice. The terror gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into a state of numb, empty fear. The figure stepped closer still, and then another, and another, until they formed a circle around him. They were closing in, tightening their grip on him, suffocating him in their presence. "Please, leave me alone," Ethan managed to whisper, his voice cracking, his throat raw. But the figure only tilted its head, its movements jerky, almost mechanical. "You are already ours," it said, the voice somehow merging with the others. It was everywhere now, inside his head, in his ears, in his bones. Ethan's body trembled. He tried to move, to run, but his limbs felt heavy, as though they were made of stone. He could not escape. The figure reached out, its hand, a clawed, elongated thing, hovering just inches from Ethan's face. His heart raced in terror as the fingers twitched, and then they grazed his cheek. And in that moment, everything stopped. The world fell away. The darkness lifted, and Ethan found himself standing alone in the void, his body weightless. He could hear nothing but the ringing silence, the kind that only exists in places beyond life. And then, a voice. Not the whispering voices of the figures, but something else, something deeper, older. "Time will reset, and you will start again." Ethan tried to speak, to cry out, but no sound came. His vision blurred, and the darkness swarmed back in, engulfing him completely. Part 2. Into the abyss, continued. Ethan awoke with a start, his body jerking upright as though wrenched from a nightmare. His breath was shallow, ragged, as if he had been submerged underwater for far too long. The air around him felt dense, heavy, like a thick fog that clung to his skin. For a long moment, he couldn't tell if he was truly awake. Was this still the same nightmare that had dragged him through the door to nowhere? Or had he crossed into another kind of hell entirely? He raised his hand to his face, half expecting to find blood or soot, some trace of his ordeal. But there was nothing, just cold, damp skin. His fingers trembled as they brushed over his cheeks. He was no longer in the void. Instead, he found himself standing in a small room. Or at least, that's what it seemed to be at first glance. The walls were composed of jagged stone, their surfaces uneven and rough, as though hastily assembled. In the dim light, shadows moved unnaturally, casting long, twisted shapes across the cracked floor. The air smelled stale, like the forgotten corners of the earth, damp and decayed. The room was suffocating in its silence, a silence so deep it felt like a living thing, one that could swallow him whole if he dared to disturb it. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but the silence made it worse. It gnawed at him, dug its claws into his skull. There were no sounds, not even the faintest whisper of wind or breath. Just an oppressive stillness that made every movement seem a violation, a disturbance to an ancient peace. But there was something more, a presence. Ethan's instincts flared, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up as though a shadow loomed over him. He could feel it, an unseen force, watching, waiting. Something was here. Something had been here long before him. The faintest flicker of movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. His heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, his pulse racing. Nothing. He exhaled shakily, his chest tightening. The flickering had been too real, too deliberate. He wasn't imagining it. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, his feet echoing softly against the stone floor. Every step felt unnatural, like his feet were not meant to touch this place. A low groan, like a distant rumble, vibrated the floor beneath him. His breath hitched. The sound felt familiar in a way that he couldn't quite place, like a memory buried deep within his subconscious, waiting to resurface. It was the sound of something moving beneath the earth, alive, crawling in the darkness. Without thinking, his feet carried him toward the center of the room. There, in the middle, stood an old, weathered mirror. The edges were cracked, the surface cloudy with age, but it was unmistakably a mirror. Ethan froze. His reflection, if that's what it could be called, was distorted. His image in the glass was warped, like a reflection caught in the midst of a fevered dream. His features were exaggerated, elongated. His eyes appeared unnaturally wide, their pupils dilated to unnerving black pools. The reflection stared back at him, but it was not quite his face. It was something else, something wrong. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead as he slowly raised a trembling hand toward the glass. The reflection mimicked him, but its fingers twitched in the mirror, a fraction too fast, a fraction too sharp. As his hand neared the surface, a sharp scraping sound echoed through the room. His reflection opened its mouth in a wide, silent scream. Ethan jerked his hand back, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The mirror flickered, as if the world behind it was unstable, shifting. A ripple spread across the surface, distorting everything. He blinked, and for a moment, the mirror no longer reflected him. Instead, it showed a vast, endless horizon. An expanse of blackened sky stretching to nowhere. A world devoid of light, filled with shadowy figures lurking in the distance. Ethan stepped back, heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing heavier, as though they were alive, creeping towards him with a mind of their own. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the room was breathing, expanding and contracting with a sickening rhythm. A voice broke the silence. "Ethan," it whispered, low and hollow, as if carried on the wind, but he couldn't tell where it came from. He spun around, his eyes scanning the room desperately. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice hoarse, panicked. Don't look away, the voice replied, closer now, sharp and cold, as though it was inside his head. Ethan's heart raced. He couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to escape this twisted nightmare. But his body refused to obey, frozen in place as the voice came again. Don't look away from the mirror. He hesitated. His eyes darted back to the mirror, and the world beyond it shifted once more. The figures from before, the faceless, twisted shadows, had begun to move closer, edging their way into the reflection. They moved like predators, silent and purposeful, their dark forms gliding toward him with unnerving precision. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him, each voice distinct, each one calling his name in 1,000 different tones. His mind buzzed with their voices, each one pressing against him, squeezing the air from his lungs. He could no longer tell where one voice ended and the next began. They were all around him, suffocating him. Why am I here? He gasped, barely able to speak. The mirror shifted again. This time, a figure stepped into the frame, a figure he recognized. It was Sarah. Her face was pale, eyes wide and empty, her lips moving but no sound escaping them. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, a surge of recognition and terror flooding through him. He had seen her. He had seen her once before, back when everything had started to fall apart. Sarah's form in the mirror twisted, distorting, like a reflection in a cracked lens. Her mouth stretched impossibly wide, her teeth sharp and yellow. She spoke, her voice an echo of something from the depths of his mind, a voice he could not forget. You shouldn't have come. You were never meant to see this. Ethan stepped back, a scream rising in his throat, but no sound came out. His body was paralyzed, his vision spinning. The room seemed to tilt and shift around him, the walls warping, twisting into unnatural angles. The mirror no longer reflected the room at all. It was as though the mirror itself was a portal, a window to another place, another reality entirely. The ground beneath him trembled. The darkness outside the mirror was expanding, creeping into the room, devouring everything in its path. The air grew colder, impossibly cold, and Ethan felt himself being drawn toward the mirror, toward the figures now reaching out of the glass, their hands outstretched, their fingers curling like claws. He tried to scream, to move, but it was too late. The figures in the mirror began to emerge, pulling themselves out of the glass, their forms stretching and distorting as they emerged into the room. They were coming for him. And in that moment, Ethan understood. The door had never been the beginning. It had always been the end. Chapter 7. The whispers beneath Ethan stumbled backwards, his pulse pounding in his ears, his breath coming in jagged gasps. His feet, numb and heavy, refused to obey him, as though the ground itself had turned against him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the world around him wavered. Was this the end? The nightmare he had always feared? The mirror, a mirror now so warped and insidious it seemed like an entire world of darkness had bled through, continued to loom in front of him. The figures emerging from it had not yet fully crossed into this world, their shapes still distorted, their limbs stretching and bending in ways that no living creature should. But that was only a fleeting thought, a passing distraction, as the true horror of the moment settled in. Ethan! The voice slithered through the air, impossibly close, like a whisper inside his skull. He felt it vibrate through his bones, crawling under his skin. His heart lurched. It was familiar, unfamiliar. There was something in it that made his stomach twist. He recognized that voice, but he couldn't, wouldn't, allow himself to admit who it was. Sarah. The word echoed through his mind, but he didn't say it aloud. He couldn't. Sarah had been dead for months. Her disappearance had left a void in his life, a dark space that no one had been able to fill. Not even the endless stream of work and meaningless distractions had managed to dull the aching emptiness that had come with her absence. Now, standing in the middle of a decaying, suffocating room, the darkness closing in from all directions, Ethan could feel her presence more vividly than ever. It wasn't just a memory. It wasn't just a figment of his mind. This was something else entirely. Her face appeared again, her pale eyes glowing with a dull, sickly light. her mouth stretching in a grotesque grin that seemed far too wide, far too eager. Her form shimmered, flickering like a broken film reel, distorted and torn apart by the very air that hung heavy with rot. She reached for him with hands that were both tender and malevolent, fingers curling in silent invitation. "Ethan, it's time." Her voice had changed. The softness was gone, replaced by something darker, something that scraped against the edges of his sanity. Without thinking, Ethan turned, his legs aching with the desperate need to flee. He bolted for the door that should not have existed in the first place. It had appeared moments ago, like an afterthought, an intrusion in the fabric of the nightmare he had found himself trapped in. Yet now, it seemed like the only way out. His body screamed for release, for escape, as his hands fumbled against the cold metal handle. But it didn't open. He tugged harder, his breath coming in ragged sobs, but the door wouldn't budge. His fingers were slick with sweat, his palms raw against the unforgiving surface. No matter how much he pulled, how much he begged it to yield, the door stayed stubbornly closed, as though mocking his very existence. "You cannot leave." The voice, Sarah's voice, echoed through his mind like a twisted lullaby. He stopped pulling, his body shuddering with exhaustion. His eyes darted to the mirror again, and this time he saw something that made his blood run cold. The figures, those shadowy, monstrous shapes, had fully emerged from the glass. They were no longer mere reflections. They were flesh and bone. The way they moved, unnatural and fluid, was like watching something from the deepest, most forbidden corners of existence. And there, standing among them, was Sarah, or, at least, what had once been Sarah. Her eyes were wide, glazed over in a way that made them appear hollow, void of life or emotion. Her body had twisted unnaturally, her limbs elongated and disjointed. She hovered, weightless, as if gravity itself had lost its power over her. She reached out toward him, her hands dripping with something dark, something slick. Her smile was twisted, stretched far beyond the limits of human expression. "You've come too far now," she whispered, her voice an echo that rattled through his very soul. "There's no turning back." No turning back. The words reverberated in his chest like a terrible omen. With a single, trembling breath, Ethan turned back to the door, but it was no longer a door. It was a mirror too, and in the reflection, the figures were closer now, pressing in from every direction, their eyes glowing with malice, their twisted forms moving toward him, as though the glass itself was being pulled apart. He stumbled backwards, his mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls narrowing like the jaws of some monstrous beast. He had no time to think, no time to understand. In the corner of the room, something moved. A dark, writhing mass, undulating like liquid smoke, began to creep from the farthest corner, pooling across the floor toward him. It didn't have a shape. It didn't need one. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form, hungry and relentless. He turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what he was running from. All he knew was that he had to escape, had to get away from the thing that was chasing him. His feet hit the cold stone floor, each step heavier than the last, his lungs burning with the effort to breathe, to exist. Behind him, he could hear the footsteps, slow, methodical, relentless. They echoed in his ears, growing louder, closer with every passing second. It was coming. The shadows grew longer, darker, and Ethan could see shapes moving within them. More figures, more faces, their hollow eyes staring at him, reaching for him with skeletal hands. The room was full of them. There was no escape. He was surrounded. "Ethan." The voice called his name, soft and sweet, just like Sarah's had been. But it wasn't Sarah anymore. The voice was warped, twisted, like an animal's growl laced with a human's whisper. He turned and saw her again. Her smile stretched unnaturally, her jaw unhinging, her body jerking forward in a way that was both human and not. Her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, fixed on him with an unrelenting intensity. He stumbled backward, his heart racing. "Come with me, Ethan." The room had become a maze of shifting corridors, walls closing in, and the endless stream of whispers surrounding him from every angle. There was nowhere to hide, no place to run. But in that moment of absolute panic, he understood. The whispers, the figures, the endless darkness. They weren't just chasing him, they were pulling him in. And he had nowhere left to go. Part 2. Ethan could feel the walls close in around him, the darkness growing thicker, like an oppressive force, smothering every flicker of light. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, as if this place had not seen the sun in centuries. It was suffocating, every breath feeling like he was inhaling ash. He stumbled backward, the cold stone floor beneath his feet becoming slick, like the very ground was alive, wet with something he dared not touch. Every step seemed to pull him deeper into the blackness that surrounded him. And the whispers, soft at first, now became deafening, an unholy choir chanting his name. Ethan, Ethan, come back to us. The voice was not Sarah's, but it was too familiar to ignore. It was a woman's voice, a broken, guttural mockery of something once warm and human. It dripped with malice, reverberating through the darkness as though it were coming from all directions, from deep within the very walls themselves. He tried to scream, to call out for help, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, choked, like the air around him had turned to mud. His chest burned with the effort to breathe, to remain conscious, but each second that passed seemed to stretch, to grow longer, as if time itself had warped in this place. The figures that had once stood at the edges of his vision now moved closer, their silhouettes becoming clearer, more defined. They were not human, not by any stretch of the imagination. Their limbs were twisted, elongated, their skin pale and sickly, their faces half masked in shadows. They moved without sound, their eyes, too many eyes, glowing faintly with an unnatural light, like the remnants of stars that had long since burned out. And then, in the midst of it all, he saw her again. Sarah. Her form floated before him, suspended in the air as though gravity had no power over her. Her head tilted slightly to the side. Her skin was pale, but not the soft porcelain he remembered. No, this skin was waxy, stretched too tight. The veins beneath it black and swollen, like the flesh was too thin for what lay beneath. Her hair, once dark and thick, now hung in strands, matted with what seemed to be blood, dirt, and something darker, something more unsettling. Ethan, she whispered, her voice no longer soft and familiar, but distant, hollow. It was as if the person he had loved, the girl he had known, the woman he had lost, was not standing in front of him anymore. Instead, it was something else, something that wore her skin, her face, and called itself by her name. Ethan, come to me. He wanted to run, he wanted to scream. But his feet were frozen, rooted to the spot as though the very air had become solid around him, pinning him in place. Every instinct screamed at him to move, but his body betrayed him, locked in a vice of terror. You belong here now. Sarah. No, not Sarah, said, her smile widening impossibly. Her eyes, hollow pits of darkness, locked onto his with a gaze that seemed to see through him, into the deepest parts of his soul. You have always belonged here. He tried to take a step back, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, warping, bending. It was as though the world itself was bending, collapsing in on him. The walls around him melted, turned liquid, as though the very reality he had known was dissolving, replaced by a darkness that had no end. From the corner of his eye, he saw the shadows, the figures, begin to move again, their twisted forms drawing closer, reaching for him. Their hands were skeletal, fingers elongated into claws, their mouths opening in unnatural yawns, filled with rows of jagged teeth, their eyes reflecting his terror. Don't you see, Ethan? Sarah's voice was softer now, but it held a sinister edge. You were always meant to join us. This is your fate, just like it was always mine. We were drawn together by the darkness. It's calling us. It's calling you. The words cut through him like a blade. He remembered the stories, the warnings, the legends of those who had vanished, drawn into the darkness by promises of something greater, something beyond the veil. those who had sought the unknown and paid the price. And now, Ethan realized with a sickening lurch in his gut, he was one of them. He had been chosen. The figures were closer now, standing just a few feet away, their hollow eyes fixed on him, the twisted smiles never fading. Their hands reached for him, their claws brushing against his skin like cold iron. Ethan recoiled, but there was no escape. He was trapped in a world that didn't care for him, that didn't care for anything except taking him deeper into its embrace. "Don't fight it, Ethan," Sarah whispered, her voice once again sweet, like a lover's lullaby. "We are together now, forever." The air grew thick, suffocating, and Ethan could feel it, could feel the change, something shifting within him, something terrible and wrong, creeping through his veins like poison. He tried to shake his head, to deny it, but his body refused to listen. His vision blurred, and he staggered as the ground seemed to give way beneath him. Then, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the room, and he turned to see the source, something much larger, much darker, crawling out of the depths of the shadows. A massive shape, its body like a writhing mass of darkness, its eyes glowing red, burning with an unnatural hunger. It was the thing that had been watching him from the moment he stepped into this place, the thing that had been pulling at his soul, drawing him in, like a spider waiting for its prey to wander too close. Its jaws opened wide, stretching unnaturally, as though the very act of opening its mouth could swallow the entire world. "Ethan," it hissed, the word drawn out in a slithering, guttural sound. "You belong to us now. Come closer." The ground trembled beneath his feet as the room twisted and churned, the air becoming thick with the scent of rot, of death. It was no longer a room, it was a tomb, a place where the living came to die, to vanish, to become part of the endless dark that called them. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat felt raw, constricted, his lungs screaming for air. He reached out, his hand trembling as he desperately grasped at anything to hold on to. But everything was slipping through his fingers, like sand, like dust, like the remnants of a world he could no longer touch. And then, with one final, crushing breath, the darkness took him. Chapter 8. The Threads of Darkness. Ethan awoke not to the comforting embrace of daylight, but to the oppressive weight of a darkness so thick it suffocated every breath. He wasn't sure how much time had passed. The clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen at midnight, or perhaps a moment far worse. He was no longer in the stone room where he had last seen Sarah, or whatever had claimed her form, but in a place colder, more twisted. The air tasted of iron, thick and metallic, like blood that had been spilt long ago. Every breath he took sent a sharp pain through his chest, as if something was trying to claw its way out from inside of him. And the sound, the whispers, soft and rhythmic, like an ancient chant, weaving in and out of his consciousness. They didn't come from a single direction, nor did they belong to any one voice. They were the voices of those who had gone before him, of souls lost to the darkness. The room, if it could still be called that, stretched before him like an endless corridor of twisted, decaying wood. The floor creaked beneath his weight, the walls lined with grotesque shadows that shifted in the dim light, bending and contorting with every step he took. The ceiling above was too high, an abyss that swallowed whatever light tried to breach it. It was as if he was walking through the belly of some forgotten beast, its walls pulsing with life, the very wood alive with malevolent intent. Ethan shuddered as his hand instinctively reached for his chest. It was cold, colder than he had ever felt before, as if his very heart had turned to ice. His fingers brushed against something smooth, hard, like stone, and yet it was as if it belonged to him, embedded deep beneath his skin. A sharp gasp escaped his lips as he stumbled backward, the sound of his own breathing deafening in the stillness. He had always feared death, but this was something far worse. This was a descent, a spiraling plunge into the unknown, into a place where the dead did not rest, but where they continued to hunger. He had to move. He had to escape. But the deeper he moved, the more the walls seemed to close in on him, their edges curling inward like the fingers of an unseen hand, squeezing him tighter with every step. "Sarah," he whispered, though he already knew she was gone. She wasn't here, not in any real sense, not in a way that could offer him comfort, or even the faintest hope, but the name lingered on his tongue, a desperate cry in the vast emptiness that surrounded him. Sarah. The silence that followed was so deafening it felt as though the world itself had stopped breathing. And then, just as he thought he might drown in the void, he heard it, a sound so faint, so far away, it almost seemed like a dream. It was a voice, but not one that could be spoken aloud. No, this voice was different. It wasn't human. It didn't belong to the living. It was something older, something primal, curling around his mind like smoke, filling him with an insatiable need to know, to understand. "Come closer." The words were soft, sweet, like a lover's whisper. They slid into his mind with the ease of a long-forgotten memory, wrapping themselves around his thoughts, leaving a bitter aftertaste. Who are you?" Ethan rasped, his voice hoarse, torn from his throat like the last shred of his will to fight. "You know me." The answer came, not in words, but in images, flickers of memories that didn't belong to him. The shadowy figure of Sarah, standing in the distance, her face twisted with agony, her eyes black pools of despair, the sense of something moving in the corners of his vision, something watching, waiting. "We are the ones who wait. We are the ones who hunger." The voice was cold now, its tone darkening, suffused with a hunger that was far more ancient than he could comprehend. And as the last syllable faded into the air, Ethan felt a sudden shift. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the whispers louder. He was not alone. Turning sharply, his eyes widened as he saw them. Figures, barely discernible, standing just beyond the edge of the dark corridor. They were watching him, their eyes glowing faintly, like embers in the night, burning with an unnatural fire. Their forms were blurry, distorted, shifting in and out of focus. But there was one thing he knew for certain. They were not human. They were something else, something worse. His heart thundered in his chest as he backed away, his hands trembling at his sides. But no matter how far he moved, the figures stayed with him, drawing closer, their movements jerky and unnatural. "You are ours now." The voice was everywhere. It was no longer a whisper, but a roar that seemed to come from every corner of the room, echoing in his mind, in his ears. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. He was not in a place of life anymore. He was not in the world he once knew. This was a place where the dead were trapped, a prison for souls who had been consumed by darkness. The figures moved closer, their forms becoming clearer, their grotesque faces emerging from the shadows. Their mouths stretched open, revealing rows of jagged teeth, their bodies swaying unnaturally as they came toward him, their eyes never leaving his. "Please," he begged, though he knew it was useless. I don't belong here." But they didn't respond. They didn't need to. Their presence was answer enough. He was theirs now, bound to the darkness, to the whispers that would never let him go. As the first of them reached out with a bony clawed hand, Ethan felt a sudden jolt, a violent tug at his chest. It was as if the very darkness was pulling him in, drawing him closer to whatever horrible fate awaited him in its depths. The walls around him seemed to pulse, the wood creaking and groaning under an unseen weight. The shadows grew thicker, their tendrils stretching toward him, wrapping around him, pulling him into the void. Ethan screamed, but no sound left his mouth. His voice was gone, consumed by the very darkness that had claimed him. All he could hear now was the soft, relentless chanting of the dead, the whispers of those who had gone before him. And as the figures closed in, the world around him darkened, swallowed by the night. Part 2. Ethan's mind struggled to grasp the terrible truth that had begun to unfurl in the depths of his consciousness. The dark figures, no longer mere shadows, moved ever closer. He could feel the coldness of their presence like a physical weight pressing down on him, each step they took in the gloom magnifying the silence. The sound of his own breath became deafening, his pulse pounding in his ears as though he were about to be crushed by the weight of the shadows. The first figure reached out with long, skeletal fingers, and Ethan's body reacted before his mind could process what was happening. His legs screamed as he turned to flee, his heart hammering in his chest. But the floor beneath him had transformed into something much darker, a viscous substance that seemed to cling to his feet, holding him in place. He stumbled, falling to his knees, and that's when he saw it. Their eyes. They were not eyes in the traditional sense. They were empty, hollow sockets that glowed faintly in the oppressive dark, swirling with an unnatural light, like stars that had long burned out, leaving only their ghostly embers behind. They didn't blink or shift in the way a living creature's eyes would. Instead, they fixed on him with an unyielding intensity, as if reading his very soul, plucking away at the fragile threads of his thoughts. A cold, high-pitched screech pierced the air, echoing through the corridor with an intensity that seemed to ripple through the very walls. Ethan clutched his head, feeling his sanity begin to unravel. It was too much. He couldn't bear it. The whispers, the sights, the overwhelming weight of the darkness pressing down on him. It was more than any human mind should endure. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to block out the horror, but it was too late. The darkness had already crept into his soul, settling there, like a poison, and he could feel it spreading, corrupting everything it touched. His breath hitched as he realized he wasn't simply trapped here. He was being consumed, slowly devoured by the very essence of this forsaken place. "Come closer," the voice spoke again, this time not as a whisper, but as a cold, suffocating command. It rang out inside his mind, echoing like a bell tolling for the dead. Ethan's eyes snapped open, but what he saw didn't make sense. The walls around him had begun to bend, warping and stretching in unnatural angles, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing at the seams. The once solid, grotesque figures began to dissipate, their bodies unraveling into wisps of shadow, disappearing into the void. But even as they faded, the weight of their presence remained, an oppressive, suffocating force that pressed down on Ethan's chest, urging him to look deeper into the dark. And then, like a thread pulled from the fabric of the night, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, Ethan thought it was Sarah, but as the figure drew closer, the shape became clearer. It was not Sarah, but something else entirely. Something far worse. The figure was tall, towering over Ethan, its body cloaked in tattered black robes that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its face was hidden beneath a dark, hooded cowl, but Ethan could feel its eyes upon him. No, not just feel them. He could see them now. The eyes were not like those of the other shadows. They were large, unnatural, and gleaming with an otherworldly light. But they weren't filled with malice or hunger. No, they were filled with something worse. Knowledge. A vast, ancient knowledge that seemed to encompass everything. The figure seemed to know him, to know his every fear, every weakness, every regret. It was a creature of darkness, a being that had seen the beginning and the end of time itself. The figure moved toward him slowly, its long skeletal fingers outstretched. Ethan recoiled, his body trembling in terror, but his legs refused to carry him any farther. The viscous darkness seemed to be tightening its grip on him, a cruel mockery of the bonds of life. "You are a thread." The voice spoke again, now deep and resonant, echoing around him like the hum of 1,000 voices speaking in unison, a thread woven into the tapestry of fate. "And I am the Weaver." Ethan's heart raced as the words sank into him. The Weaver. He had heard that term before, in the whispered rumors that had haunted his dreams. It was the name of an ancient entity, one said to be the architect of the realm between life and death. The Weaver was a force, an unfeeling, impartial being that bound the souls of the dead, shaping their fates like a weaver crafting a tapestry. But it was more than that. It was a collector of souls, a force that consumed, that twisted and turned the lives of those it touched. You're the Weaver?" Ethan choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond with words. Instead, it raised its hand, and from the folds of its dark robes, a thread of silver emerged. It shimmered in the dim light, stretching between the Weaver's fingers. Ethan's eyes widened as he watched it unravel, slowly, like a thread from an old, forgotten loom. The silver thread wound through the air, wrapping itself around Ethan's chest, tightening, pulling him forward. He could feel it pulling at him, tugging at his very soul. The thread wasn't just a physical thing. It was a part of him now, woven into his existence. It was as if the Weaver had already begun to rewrite his fate. "You were never meant to leave," the Weaver said, its voice now a low, guttural whisper. "You are a part of this place now. A thread, a fragment of the dark tapestry I have woven. There is no escape." Ethan's breath hitched as the dark figure stepped closer, its long shadow stretching across the floor, swallowing him whole. He struggled against the pull of the thread, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong. His body felt heavy, his limbs unresponsive, as if the very weight of the Weaver's gaze was enough to keep him rooted to the spot. But the thread was not the only thing binding him. The whispers had grown louder, more frantic, like an army of souls screaming in agony, their voices swirling around him, drowning him in their pain. He could feel them now, feel their suffering, their torment. The souls of those who had been claimed by the darkness, bound by the Weaver's hand. Ethan's heart twisted in horror as he realized the truth. The Weaver didn't just consume souls, it twisted them, shaping them into something else, something unrecognizable. And soon, he would be one of them. But before he could comprehend the full depth of his fate, the Weaver raised its other hand. A second thread appeared, black as midnight. And this one was not for him. It was for Sarah. Chapter 9. The Tapestry Unravels. The Weaver's figure loomed over Ethan, its dark presence pressing in on him like the weight of 1,000 forgotten years. The silver thread it held stretched impossibly long, its shimmer almost blinding. Ethan wanted to scream, to shout, but his throat felt as though it had been clogged with the very air around him, thick and heavy with an otherworldly pressure. "You've been marked," the Weaver's voice echoed in his mind, an ancient whisper that seemed to wrap itself around his consciousness, like a slow, tightening coil. The voice wasn't physical. It wasn't something his ears could hear, but somehow he could feel it. His eyes flickered to the black thread that the Weaver had woven for Sarah. It was a chilling sight, the thread moving on its own accord, as though it had a life of its own. The thread snaked across the space between them, a dark path trailing from the Weaver's hand, twisting and turning as if searching for its destination. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The Weaver's gaze was fixed on him, unblinking, and with each second, the thread tightened around him, the very air growing denser, heavier. It felt like the walls of the room were closing in, warping into strange shapes, their very forms shifting as if they weren't entirely real. "Why Sarah?" Ethan gasped, his voice barely a whisper, as he struggled to tear his gaze away from the swirling threads. "What do you want with her?" The Weaver did not answer at first. Instead, it took a slow step forward, its form almost dissolving into the shadows. Its presence seemed to stretch, expanding across the room, making the walls around them fade into darkness. Then finally, the voice came, thick, cold, and almost amused. "She is a part of the design," the Weaver said, its tone carrying the weight of inevitability. "Each thread, every soul I claim, is necessary. She is as much a part of the tapestry as you are, Ethan, and soon her fate will be intertwined with yours. The tapestry cannot exist without sacrifice, without loss, without death." Ethan's mind raced. A sacrifice? The tapestry. He could barely comprehend what the Weaver was saying. It was as though each word took his mind farther away from the present, plunging him into a timeless void. The very concept of time was slipping away, like sand through his fingers, leaving nothing but this suffocating reality. The silver thread was so close now. Ethan could almost feel it against his skin, the cold metal-like energy it carried making his muscles freeze in place. It was pulling him, no, dragging him, toward the Weaver. His limbs were no longer his own, as though invisible chains had wrapped themselves around his wrists and ankles, tightening with every breath he took. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tension snapped. Ethan was thrust forward, crashing into the cold stone floor, his body sinking into the earth itself, swallowed by the darkness. He fought against the pull, struggling to stand, but his body was slow, sluggish, as though it were made of something heavier than flesh. The Weaver's voice reverberated in his skull. "You are trapped, Ethan," it said. "There is no escape from this place, from me." But Ethan refused to accept that. He couldn't. Not again. Not after everything he had already been through. He had to find a way out. He had to save Sarah. He gritted his teeth, forcing his hands against the ground, pushing up from the cold, dark earth. His arms trembled from the effort, but he felt the pull lessening, just slightly. There was a flicker of hope, a sliver of strength left in him. And then, the world around him began to change. The stone floor cracked open, a jagged gash tearing through the fabric of reality itself. Ethan's eyes widened as he saw what lay beneath it, a chasm, black and endless, its depth stretching further than he could comprehend. The air grew colder still, and Ethan could hear the faintest whisper from below, as though thousands of voices were calling out to him from the abyss. The thread that had been binding him snapped taut, pulling tighter, as though the very essence of the Weaver's power was pressing down upon him. The silver thread was no longer merely an object. It was a living thing, a part of the Weaver's will, wrapping around Ethan's body, tightening like a noose. He fought harder now, every muscle in his body screaming in protest, but it was no use. The thread had already begun to pierce his skin, threading its way into him, as though the Weaver's power was seeking to merge with his very essence. The coldness he had felt earlier was now inside him, clawing at his bones, twisting in his veins. "No!" Ethan cried out, but the words felt foreign on his tongue. They were swallowed by the void, devoured before they could even reach the air. The Weaver stepped closer, its towering presence now towering over him, its hooded face still hidden in shadow. The empty blackness of the figure's eyes seemed to widen, as though seeing him clearly for the first time. And in that moment, Ethan realized something horrifying. The Weaver was not just an entity, it was a part of something much older, something that existed beyond the very concept of time and space. It was a force of nature, a force that had seen the birth and death of countless worlds, a being as old as the stars themselves. "You've been woven into the tapestry, Ethan," the Weaver intoned, its voice deep and hollow. "Every thread you've touched, every soul you've crossed paths with, they were all part of the design. You, Sarah, the others, they were always meant to be here. This is not the first time. It will not be the last." Ethan felt his stomach turn, bile rising in his throat. His mind screamed, but his voice refused to obey him. The Weaver's grip on him was unrelenting, suffocating, as though it had reached into the very core of his being, pulling out everything that made him human. The figure raised its hand, and the chasm beneath him deepened, widening further. The very fabric of reality seemed to tear, and for a moment, Ethan could see beyond the darkness, into a place where time did not exist, where the very concept of death was meaningless. "I will take you now," the Weaver said. And with that, it pulled the silver thread taut, the dark force lifting Ethan off the ground as though he were weightless. His limbs hung limp, his body no longer his own, as he was drawn toward the abyss. But then, a scream echoed in the distance. A voice, familiar, desperate, reached his ears. "Ethan!" It was Sarah. The thread that had been coiling around Ethan's chest seemed to falter for a moment. A brief flicker of hesitation in the Weaver's hold. For a second, Ethan felt something stir deep inside him. A glimmer of hope that refused to die. Sarah. The sound of her voice, the way it had cut through the darkness, gave him strength he didn't know he had. The Weaver had underestimated the power of human connection. The power of love. Ethan's mind raced, his thoughts swirling like a storm as he fought against the pull, as he fought for her, for them both. The Weaver's grip tightened once more, but it was no longer unbreakable. Chapter 10. Threads of Fate. The dark room seemed to fold in on itself, the walls stretching and warping as though they were alive, pulsating with an otherworldly energy. Ethan stood at the center of it, the silver thread still wrapped tightly around his chest. Digging into his skin, it burned with a cold fire, each second that passed only deepening its cruel grasp. His breath was shallow, his thoughts fragmented, but there was no mistaking the overwhelming presence that loomed over him. The Weaver had retreated into the shadows, its figure now an almost imperceptible blur, but Ethan could feel its eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, watching him, studying him as though he were nothing more than an insect pinned to a board. And yet, despite the overwhelming terror that gripped him, despite the pull of the dark, vast chasm beneath him, there was something within him that refused to give in. He could still hear Sarah's voice faintly echoing in his mind. It was a tether, a lifeline that kept him from spiraling into despair. But as he focused on the thread, the memories began to fade, replaced by something else, something ancient, sinister. The room began to change. The floor beneath him seemed to crack open, revealing an endless, swirling abyss. The very air was thick with the scent of decay, as though the room itself had been buried for centuries, forgotten by time. Ethan struggled against the silver thread, but it held him in place. His skin was raw where it had cut into him, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he could not afford to stop fighting. If he gave in now, it would be the end of everything. "You cannot escape," the Weaver's voice reverberated from the shadows. It was no longer a whisper. It was an echo of something far older, far more powerful than anything Ethan had ever known. The voice seemed to fill every corner of the room, crawling into his skin, invading his thoughts. "This is the way of the tapestry. You have been woven into it, and now you must pay the price." The room around him flickered, as though it were some kind of illusion, its form unstable, shifting between reality and nightmare. The Weaver's presence was like a shadow, hanging just out of reach, impossible to grasp but all-encompassing, its weight heavier than any physical force. But then a familiar voice broke through the oppressive silence. "Ethan!" It was Sarah. Her voice was faint, like a distant echo, but it was enough. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He was not alone. She was still out there, still fighting. With a sudden burst of determination, he focused all of his remaining strength into pushing against the thread, forcing his body to move despite the overwhelming force that bound him. His arms burned with the effort. His legs felt like they were made of lead. But he couldn't stop now. The Weaver's words rang in his ears, but he couldn't afford to listen. He had to find Sarah. The shadows around him seemed to writhe, like serpents coiling and uncurling in the dark. As his body shook with the strain, the air began to thicken once more, until it was suffocating, choking him. The blackness seemed to close in, and for a moment, he thought he might suffocate, consumed by the darkness. But then, there was a sound, a low hum. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder until it resonated deep within his chest. It was a song, an old song, one that he recognized from his childhood. The melody was distant, familiar, but it was warped, distorted, as though it were being sung by 1,000 voices, all overlapping, twisting in an endless cycle. The sound seemed to come from the cracks in the floor, from the very walls that surrounded him. It was the tapestry, Ethan realized. The song was a reflection of the fabric of fate itself, weaving and unweaving, threading through time and space, pulling at the very core of his being. The ground beneath him shifted, and Ethan stumbled, his hands pressed against the stone floor for balance. He was no longer in the room, no longer in the space he had been trapped in for what felt like an eternity. Instead, he stood in an open field. The air was cold, biting against his skin. The sky above him was impossibly dark, swirling with clouds that seemed to churn like a storm. But it wasn't the sky that made his heart stop. It was the figure standing before him, Sarah. Her figure was shrouded in darkness, her face hidden beneath a cloak of shadows. The air around her seemed to pulse with an energy that was both alien and familiar, something not entirely human. She stood motionless, her eyes hidden from view, her body still as stone. "Sarah," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible against the rising wind. She didn't respond. Instead, the wind seemed to carry a low, mournful cry, echoing through the field. The tapestry, the threads, the endless, twisting threads that bound them all. Ethan stepped toward her, the pull of the silver thread around his chest still burning like ice. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he neared her. He had to save her. He couldn't let her become a part of this, not again. But as his hand touched the cold, shadowed figure before him, the world seemed to shatter. The field was gone, the sky fractured like glass, and the earth beneath him crumbled away, pulling him into the void. Ethan fell. It was not a fall of distance, it was a fall through time, through memories, through the tapestry itself. He was falling through 1,000 lifetimes, 1,000 versions of himself, each one, each soul, connected by the threads that bound them. Each one a part of the same design, the same curse. Ethan's body was no longer his own. His hands were not his hands. His legs were not his legs. His very essence was scattered, torn between the countless versions of himself that had existed in the fabric of fate. He was everywhere, and yet nowhere. He was lost. Ethan! The voice came again, faint, like the whisper of wind. He couldn't tell if it was Sarah or some other voice, someone from another time, another life. But he knew that it was calling to him. He could not answer. As the darkness surrounded him, as the threads of fate tightened and twisted around him, Ethan understood. There was no escape. There was only the tapestry, and it would weave him into itself until nothing remained. Final chapter. The last thread. The cold wind whispered, threading its way through the cracks in the walls of the endless void. Ethan could feel it creeping under his skin, its chill like the breath of a forgotten god, long abandoned to the night. His body, if it could still be called that, hung suspended in the infinite expanse, the tapestry still pulling at his soul. He had no sense of time anymore. Days, years, centuries, none of it mattered here. The seconds were eternal, and in every moment the thread of fate wrapped tighter around him, around all of them. Every life, every moment had been planned, woven into the great design of the tapestry. Every heartbeat, every breath he had ever taken, had been nothing more than a stitch in a vast, incomprehensible web. His mind, if it could still think, was consumed with the question, what is the purpose of this? He reached out into the darkness, his fingers brushing against the threads that bound him. They were cold, like frozen steel, yet impossibly delicate. His entire existence was suspended on the edge of one thin strand, one weak pull that could snap him into oblivion or tie him to this endless cosmic design. He had thought, in his previous lives, that there would be an answer, that if he fought hard enough, if he struggled long enough, he could break free. But each time he had tried, each time he had rebelled, the tapestry had pulled him back. It always found him. It always found everyone. And now I'm no different, he realized. His fight had been nothing but a brief flicker in the grand, eternal weave. He wasn't special. He wasn't unique. He was just another thread, another part of the endless pattern. In his mind's eye, Sarah appeared again, her face obscured by the shadows that had haunted him throughout this nightmare. Her voice, once so clear, now came to him in broken echoes. He reached for her, but she was always just out of reach. There is no escape, he thought, finally understanding. No freedom, only the weave. The truth had come to him in flashes, in bursts of terrifying clarity. The tapestry had been weaving them all together, all along. It wasn't just him. It wasn't just Sarah. It was everyone he had ever known, every stranger he had ever crossed paths with. They were all part of the same design. They had always been, and they always would be. Even the weaver, itself a prisoner, a servant of the tapestry, was just another part of the web. It too was bound to the threads that wove existence together, the force that commanded the universe in ways no mortal mind could comprehend. A deep guttural voice broke through his thoughts. You are nothing more than a ghost, Ethan. The weaver's voice, cold and commanding, resonated around him as though it came from all directions at once. It had no body, no form. It was a presence, a force, a reality he could not escape. You've fought and struggled, but it has all been for nothing, the voice continued. You are already a part of the design. You cannot unweave what has already been tied together. Ethan's chest tightened as the words sunk in. He wanted to scream, to fight. But the reality of it, this cold, final truth, was suffocating. He wasn't a hero, and neither was Sarah. They were pawns, nothing more, caught in a game they couldn't see. And yet, despite this crushing realization, despite the overwhelming darkness that pressed down on him, something stirred within him, something small, but insistent, a flicker of defiance. "Then why am I still here?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with the remnants of his will. The weaver's voice laughed, a sound like 100 needles scraping against stone. "Because you think you still have a choice." A cold, sharp light flashed through the void, and Ethan felt his consciousness stretch and snap, as though his very soul were being torn in two. The threads around him, those endless, intricate strands of fate, shifted, and for a brief moment, he was free. For a single fleeting moment, Ethan was not a part of the tapestry. His existence was no longer bound by time, by fate. He felt the wind on his skin, the warmth of the sun against his face, the weight of his own body. For that moment, he was real again, but it was only a moment. And then the threads wrapped around him once more, pulling him back into the design. But this time, it wasn't just the threads that held him, it was the weight of understanding, the crushing realization that freedom was an illusion, that the tapestry was not just a cosmic force, but a part of him, a part of everyone. Ethan had fought, he had resisted, he had wanted to escape. But in the end, the tapestry was not something to be fought, it was something to be accepted. And in the acceptance, there was peace. The weaver's voice faded into the darkness as Ethan's body melted into the threads that had always been there, waiting. Sarah's voice whispered in his ear, faint and distant, like the last breath of a dying star. "We are all threads in the weave, and we will never truly be lost." And then there was nothing, no more struggle, no more fear, just the eternal, undying thread of existence, woven into the infinite fabric of the universe. The end.